think we're ready to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, good afternoon, good afternoon. If you can take your seats and we're gonna get started shortly. So welcome to us, usual Wednesday seminar series. I'm glad you be here in person, and those who are joining online, I'm happy you're able to join us. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Before I get into the formal introduction, let me start with informal, because I happen to know her personally as well. I met our speaker about 10 years ago in the green room of Kenya National TV, where we'd been asked to show up at, I think, 7:30 a.m. We sat in that green room, I think, until like 11:30, drinking lots of tea or coffee. And we got, to give an interview on a big event that was happening in Nairobi. So after that, our speaker invited me to a house with lunch, and I've known her since then, and I've met her in so many different platforms, and it's quite a privilege to know her. But for the formal introduction, Dr. Jemimah Njuki, who is a speaker today, is the Director for Africa for the International Food Policy Research Institute, also known as IFPRI, which is part of the CG system. She has more than 20 years of experience in the agricultural sector in Africa and Asia, working on gender equality and the empowerment of women. She has published extensively on topics such as gender and technology, impacts of women's time in agriculture on caregiving practices and nutrition, indicators for women empowerment, the trade-offs between market development and women's income control, approaches to linking smallholder women farmers to markets, and gender transformative food systems. Her current research focuses on how to make food systems more equitable and gender transformative. She is usually based out of Nairobi, but I hear she's joining us now from a hotel room in Vancouver. Dr. Jemimah Njuki, it's a delight to have you here. You have the floor. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's give you a cordial round of applause.
Thank you so much for having me, and Ed for that fantastic introduction. I actually do remember our interview at the Nation in Nairobi. It's such a pleasure to see you all. I've been in online meetings so much the last couple of weeks. I'm just delighted to actually see people sitting in a room. So that's really great to see. I've basically been presenting, including for the UN Food Systems Summit last week, to just other screens, basically. So thank you so much for having me here. And what I thought I would do today is really talk about how we can reimagine solutions to gender inequality. And as Ed mentions, I have been working on gender equality and the empowerment of women, especially in the agriculture sector, for many years, for about 20 years now. And what has struck me and continues to strike me is that the conversations that we were having 20 years ago when I joined the agriculture sector to work on issues of gender, the conversations we were having when I was doing my PhD on gender and farming systems, a lot of those seem to be the same conversations we are having today. And it's not to say that we haven't made a lot of progress. I think we very well agreed that we have made a lot of progress in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment. There are things we know now that we didn't know before about what works. There are things we know now about the contexts and the norms and policies and institutional barriers that continue to reinforce inequalities. So there's a whole set of knowledge and tools that we have gained. And yet the conversations remain fundamentally the same. We are still talking about lack of access to resources for women as producers, lack of finance for women as entrepreneurs. We're still talking about norms that continue to hinder women from living meaningful and dignified lives. And so it strikes me that we need to reimagine the things that we do and do them differently if we are really to make progress. And I did want to give a disclaimer that what I'm going to talk to you about today is probably not anything fundamentally new. I don't have a new science or fix-it gadget that we've suddenly discovered about how to solve these problems. But it's really applying the same solutions, but applying them in different ways, in ways that actually impact women and impact women at scale, in a way that transforms gender and social relations and transforms them in a sustainable way that gets us to reach what I call tipping points, because that's language that's used a lot we used to use a lot of that in livestock. I worked for the International Livestock Research Institute for years, and we would talk about these ecological tipping points. And it would appear to me that in the work on gender equality and women's empowerment, we do need to reach social tipping points where we know that the gains we are getting can be sustained. Even just with COVID-19, we have seen how far back it has driven women in terms of loss of jobs, loss of livelihoods. So how can we get to these social tipping points where we know there's going to be fundamental shifts and fundamental changes that can be sustained? And so that's what I'm going to focus on today, and just draw a bit on my experiences, but also on these last 12 months that I have been engaged with this global community of people as part of the UN Food Systems Summit. So and I'm going to start from the history, as I said. So we've come from decades of very innovative work, especially around feminist movements and feminist movement building, especially within the social sectors, within health, within education, but just also women's rights, whether it is to vote, whether it is the right to work, and so on. And when I reflect on those decades, including from the 50s and early 60s and 70s, what I'm convinced of is that, and especially our practice in how we think about gender equality in agriculture, in food systems, has not moved at the same pace as the theoretical debates as much as the movement building has moved. And one of the reasons I really talk about this is because in the 80s, we started a process of what we called gender analysis and figuring out what were the issues within our planning processes. And so these gender analysis frameworks and tools entered our development space, they entered our agriculture space, they entered our planning space. And basically the aim was to create this understanding of what the gender differences and the gender gaps were, whether it was in access to resources, in the division of labor, etc. And I am not rubbishing these frameworks, because in a lot of ways they aided a lot in gender planning within sort of what you would call the development sectors. But at the same time, they had huge gaps in the way they addressed the underlying causes of gender inequality, and in the way they didn't help us to conceptualize and measure gender equality and the empowerment of women. For those of you who are old enough like me, you will remember the days of Robert Chambers and Farmers First. It was a huge movement back in the early 90s about how we put farmers first in development. And the concept and the theoretical basis of it were very fundamental, in the sense that it was about making sure that those to whom development is supposed to happen actually have a fundamental say in how that development happens. And so he came up with all these tools, the participatory rural appraisal tools, the rapid rural appraisal tools that were supposed to give voice to farmers and producers and people. But what very quickly happened is the fundamental principles around those tools at some point got lost along the way. And we started applying the tools as tools. They even at some point became tools for data collection. I'm sure there's some students in the room who probably have written their proposals around how they're gonna use PRA tools to collect data. The whole point of PRA tool was not to collect data. At least the fundamental principle around them was not to collect data. It was to give voice to farmers. It was to give voice to producers. It was to give voice to communities. And that same thing I have seen happen to what we call these gender analytical tools, whereas they were supposed to help us figure out what are the needs, priorities of communities and of women, and what are some of the underlying issues that need to be dealt with. They quickly became tools for data collection on who does what in the household, without much reflection on what are some of the underlying issues around some of the things that we see. The best analogy I usually give for it is when you have symptoms of if you have fever or you have joint pains and you go to the doctor can do two things. They can give you something to relieve the pain and the fever, or they can try and find out what's causing the pain and the fever. Yeah, and in a way we have decided to give medicine to alleviate the pain and the fever without necessarily going deeper and saying, oh, could it be malaria? Could we be dealing with plasmodium here and not just fever and pain? So these underlying causes of gender inequality are what we need to get to the bottom of if we actually want to see fundamental shifts. Because guess what? If you relieve the pain and the fever and the plasmodium is still in your body, tomorrow morning, once it wears off, you wake up with pain and fever again, because the plasmodium still resides within your blood. And that's why I keep saying we have to deal with these underlying causes if we want to see fundamental change and sustained change. When we deal with gender gaps as we see them, when we see differences in access to resources and we say, okay, guess what? We just need to give women more money. There is a reason those fundamental gaps exist. And until we deal with those, we cannot fix one woman at a time. We've got to fix the systems and the underlying things that are causing these differences. And so it brings us to what we call this continuum of approaches, right? And the basic continuum, now there's all sorts of different iterations of this, but really the basic continuum of this is three basic approaches. These are the exploitative approaches, the accommodating approaches, and the transformative approaches. And unfortunately, up to now, we still continue to see these exploitative approaches. And these are approaches that reinforce or take advantage of gender inequalities and stereotypes. And because we want to advance some sectoral some sectoral goals, but some of these continue to reinforce these inequalities. A typical example I would give is if you look at the gender division of labor within households, you start to see in a lot of cases in rural spaces where there's a very clear division of labor where and I guess in developed countries as well, where caregiving is mainly a task that is done by women. So if you have a program and you decide, okay, I have a program on household nutrition, and you decide I'm going to train women on how to feed their families, because the gender division of labor says that it is women who are doing this. What you do, even as an external influence, is you start reinforcing this idea that that is women's roles. Yeah, you start reinforcing. You continue to reinforce that. You know, instead of looking at, is this a biological role, or is this a role that's informed by culture, by customs? Does it harm women? Does it stop them from seeking economic opportunities? Does it, you know, reinforce their burden, their domestic load, in addition to other things that they have to do? Am I adding to that load by taking the approach that I am taking? And we continue to see a lot of these approaches still in play. And then there's the accommodating piece, where we really just walk around existing differences and inequalities. Oh, women can't own cows, we'll just do chickens because they're allowed to own chickens. We're not gonna question why they can't own cows. We're just gonna go around, give them some chickens, hopefully they'll figure the cow bit eventually by themselves, and maybe they will, but we do have a role to start these conversations that examine some of these issues. And that's where the transformative bit comes in, because the transformative fosters this critical examination of norms and dynamics, and really plays a critical role in strengthening and creating equitable gender norms and dynamics. And I'm not trying to say that as external people, it is, you know, we are the best placed to change these, but we do have a role to start those conversations. But at the same time, you will realize a lot of these conversations are already happening, and communities sometimes just need the impetus to continue these conversations. I started my international career in Malawi, and one of back in the days before I even met Ed and many other people as I was starting out. And one of the conversations we used to have was on gender equality with respect to nutrition. And part of my job was to work with communities to develop these indicators of change. How will we know gender relations are changing with respect to nutrition? And one of the practices in the area of Malawi where I was working was that food got cooked, and what would happen is, because of the village setup, sometimes the men would eat first because the food is brought out all in common pots, and the men of the family eat, and then the children of the family eat, and then the women eat. And the groups of young men, especially, that we were developing these indicators with, one of the things they kept repeating over and over again is, we want change. We want to see our families eat together. Yeah. So some of these things, we're not even the ones that are bringing. A lot of that change is already brewing within that local context, and just needs the avenue to facilitate it to happen at a broader or deeper scale. Now, from a research perspective, so my colleagues and I at IFPRI have been working on this framework that we're calling the Reach, Benefit, and Empower framework. because these are also conversations I hear a lot that I think are also hindering us from getting to change. Where people say, we trained women and we empowered them. Exactly how did you empower women by training them? And I'm sure you have all manner of different versions of these statements, that we give them chickens. My first degree was in livestock, so I have a lot of examples from livestock. Like, we gave women chickens and we empowered them. Or we had a project that empowered women. But what are we really saying? And we need to differentiate between when we just reach women. We reached them with a service, we reached them with a technology, we reached them with information, and call it that. Because for every single time we've heard people talk about empowering women, we would all be out of jobs now. Every single woman on this planet would be empowered for every single time we say we have empowered women. But really, a lot of what we are doing is we are reaching women. We are targeting women by using women as extension agents, by getting women to attend trainings. All we are doing is reaching women. Whether that leads to women benefiting is a subject of very many factors. Yeah. Did we increase women's income because we trained them? Now we start moving from the realm of reaching women to the realm of actually benefiting women. And the strategies to get there, this is the fundamental piece, because the strategies to benefit women are very different from the strategies to reach women. Yeah. Now, when we then even, and sometimes I do want to mention this, sometimes the difference between reaching women and benefiting women is an addition of activities, right? Sometimes it can be as basic as adding a few things. But when we then start thinking of empowering women, this becomes a whole different perspective. Because if you look at the definition of empowerment, as women making strategic decisions about their lives that they have been denied before, then just adding an activity may not be it. It becomes a fundamental shift in how we do things. It becomes a fundamental shift in what we do. Are we improving women's agency in the production and livelihood decisions? Yeah. What approaches are we using to do this? How are we measuring it? Yeah. So these then become a very fundamental shift in the approaches we use. We start talking about how do you change norms and behavior? How do you change policies? How do you change institutions? Because then it goes beyond just building women's agency. It goes beyond just training women. It goes beyond just giving chickens to women, because you start getting into the realms of how are they making decisions about the important things in their lives. So this has been a very important contribution to how we actually conceptualize how we do interventions, how we do projects, how we design the approaches that we use. Now, within the food systems process, I've sort of tried to bring this to life, because a lot of the conversations have been about the role that women play in food production. Every government statement has started with, and women are important in our food production. People have attributed all manner of percentages. They produce 80% of food, depends on who's speaking where and when. And that figure can change so dramatically, actually. But the point I've been trying to make is we need to shift our thinking to not just talking about what they're contributing, what is it they're lacking, to how we design our systems so that they contribute to this process of women's empowerment. How do we do things differently so that we contribute to this process of empowerment? And that has, it's been an upward task, but by the Food Systems Summit last week, I have just reviewed the government statement that the presidents made, and really great to see some of the shift in thinking around how we design these systems to work for women. And this brings me to these, what I call these domains of change that have to work in tandem. It is, and the changes at individual level, but also at systemic level. It is formal and it is informal. And the individual change starts with expanding, what I call expanding women's agency. And this is not just skills, but it's also raising consciousness and awareness, its capacities, its behavior, yeah? And then the access to resources and opportunities, because these are still important components of gender equality and women's empowerment. But these two alone are not going to be sufficient until we focus on the systemic change, the informal cultural norms and deep structures, and the formal policies, laws, and institutional arrangements that define whether it's our food systems, whether it is our health systems, whether it is our education systems, because these applies across board. And I'll just start with agency. And I don't want to dwell too much on this, because this is sort of the realm that is most understood. You know, you can train women to have the power to do things, you know, the ability to do things. Whether you're talking about financial literacy and financial inclusion, what you're really doing is expanding the power to do things. But there's also the power within. There's intrinsic agency that people have, yeah. That feeling of having agency. When we started working on the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index as a qualitative researcher myself, what I wanted to find out was the women that the index said were empowered, they had a certain score. Did they feel empowered? Because that's important, that's fundamental. Because I cannot say people are empowered if they do not feel themselves that they're empowered. And about half of the time, those women that the index said were empowered, they had achieved a certain threshold of the index. About half of the time, they themselves, as women, did not feel empowered. Either because their definition of empowerment was very different from our definition of empowerment, or they still hadn't grown that power within to feel that they were agents of change themselves. So this power within is sort of like the building block for everything, building this consciousness. And I'm not saying it's the power to tell women you can do anything you want in the world, maybe they can, but you've got to deal with the institutional barriers that then stop them from that. But there's also the power with, and that this is why the feminist movement have been so successful, that collective agency the people have. It is why there's been a history of working in producer groups, a history of farmer associations or producer associations, because that's where women exercise their collective agency. And then we have the power over, and more we are also talking about the power to empower others, these grassroots movements that actually have the power to empower others within their communities. So when we talk about agency, we also need to expand our minds to what agency really means, because we tend a lot to focus on this instrumental agency, the capacity. Every proposal has building capacity of women somewhere, you know, because we've focused a lot on this instrumental agency, but are we also building this consciousness of the power within, unleashing that power within? But as well as the power with and the power to empower. The second thing I want to talk about, and I'll be very brief with this because I actually took these graphics off the internet because these are things we see every time. There's gaps in access to resources, whether it's financial resources, that's, you know, men and women who have an account, and you can take any variable here and you'll see what these gaps are. And what has been striking for me is about 4 years ago, I started working on financial inclusion, and the percentage gap in financial inclusion hasn't actually fallen since 2011, despite everything that we've been doing the last couple of years. That gap hasn't shifted in like 11 years now. So we still need to really sit down and say, what are we not doing? What are we not doing right? We know gaps in education, those have closed significantly, and other gaps as well, but we're still having some really persistent gaps. And this brings me to these other two areas that we don't focus too much on: the changing social norms and harmful social norms, shifting these norms, because shifting these also has implications on people's own personal beliefs. Now, this is a whole area of work in terms of people thinking about what is typical for them as a community, what is appropriate to do, and their social belief system, which can be very important in terms of forming and sustaining communities. But what happens is, if those norms are harmful to certain groups, they cause a lot of the gaps that we see. If we think it is not appropriate for a woman to work, then we start seeing the gaps in economic empowerment. If we think it is not appropriate for a woman to walk alone and go to the market, we start seeing the gaps in market participation. But the problem is not that women don't want to go to the market. The problem is they don't feel it is appropriate for them to go to the market. The men don't think it's appropriate for women to go to the market. And this all goes back to the norms and belief systems. And until we change this closing of gaps is gonna be slow and painful for all of us. And then there's the policies and institutions. I'm gonna give you a quick example very soon as I close. I know I don't have the whole day to talk about this. I would love to, but there is a report that I think everybody should read. I read it, I wait for it every year. It's called the Women, Business and Law, and it's done by the World Bank, and every year it comes out. And I love reading this report, and this is usually the first table I go to. So it's called The Economies Across All Regions, where they undertook reforms toward gender equality. And it always makes interesting reading because it leaves you asking, really, there are countries where women weren't allowed to do that? So in terms of mobility, Benin, Fiji, Jordan, United Arab Emirates finally allowed a woman to apply for a passport in the same way as a man, finally, in 2020. So this is always an interesting part of the report to see, because it starts showing you the role of policies and institutions in empowering women and in achieving women's empowerment. In terms of pay, you can see the economies where something happened. Costa Rica lifted a ban on women's night work. The United Arab Emirates no longer requires a married woman to obey her husband. That goes back to the norms. And a couple of countries there that finally introduced 2 weeks of paid parental leave as an individual entitlement for each parent. So this sort of shows you some of the issues that actually constrain women and men sometimes from that policy perspective. And these are important because if Costa Rica had a ban on women's night work, it means a lot of women couldn't work as night nurses or whatever other night work is available, right? Or paid parental leave that has an impact on women's economic participation. Yeah. So in terms of reimagining solutions, what am I then talking about? I'm talking about going beyond expanding agency and increasing women's access to resources to actually focus on addressing some of these harmful social norms, but also figuring out how we change institutions, frameworks, and regulatory policies and regulatory frameworks to make sure that they work. But also how we take this concept beyond the analytical frameworks we are so used to, how we take these 4 domains of change and start integrating them into sectoral programming, because that's how we get to impact. But the third thing that I really always finish with is using this intersectional approach to focus on multiple axes of marginalization and privilege. So beyond agency and resources, to really focus on these domains. I want to talk about, as an example, the transformative financial inclusion for women that I've been working on the last couple of years. Now, a lot of focus has been on what we call the agency side, the demand side. Financial literacy training for women, a lot of programs around that, and they are all important programs. Getting women to understand how markets and how financial systems work, all very important. In terms of making sure women have financing, you go to most countries now, especially in Africa, in Asia, you'll find a women enterprise fund set up by government, set up by the African Development Bank, set up by somebody to increase access to women's financing. But what we are not talking enough about is actually how financial institutions themselves need to change their way of doing business, their rules, their regulations, so that those work for women, whether it is waiving things like collateral, whether it is allowing women to actually take loans without the signed consent of spouses. So a lot of the regulatory frameworks of institutions themselves. But also I say every person who takes a loan now, especially with fintech, probably every week or every end of the month, you get a message that's telling you, I don't know, but fintech has revolutionized how these things work. I get a message from my bank telling me my arrears are due or whatever. And one of the programs I had just before I left IDRC is with the microfinance bank in Tanzania, saying, but how can you take advantage of that network to actually include gender messaging in those messages? Yeah? What if the message every morning is, if you have loans with men, financial planning and joint decision making with your spouse is good for your family? What if that's the messaging people are getting every morning about around financial inclusion? Would that make a change to how people see and households see how to work with together and improve women's decision making? And I'm just giving a basic example here. It could be much deeper than that. But we did try that, including with an experimental design in Tanzania, to see how it works. And one of the biggest pieces of work that I've been involved in the last few months is incorporating this 4 domains into our programming and our thinking about food systems transformation. So there's now a new framework. The food systems transformation framework has been completely gender blind outside of the fact that we want to see outcomes on gender equality and women's empowerment. But it was never clear how those outcomes would come about. And so we have redesigned the conceptual framing of food systems transformation to actually include these four domains. Very quickly, Ed, if you let me, I know I probably have a minute left now to talk about intersectionality, because we need to understand that people's social and political identities can combine to create very different modes of discrimination and privilege. What I could do as a young woman and what my grandmother could do and get away with as an older woman are two different things, yeah? Because you have age and you have your identity as a woman and you have your identity as an indigenous person, all coming together to compound either privilege or discrimination. And we really need to think about this when we work with communities. And my biggest issue of how we've dealt with this in our research, in our food systems thinking, is we've used them as analytical categories, yeah? Without going deeper to actually understand what does it mean for a young person to be in agriculture today in Africa? What does it mean for an indigenous young woman to be in agriculture today? What are the axes of marginalization that we need to deal with when we work with these groups? It's not just an analytical category, it's a fundamental way in which discrimination and privilege happens. And we need to figure this out when we do our research and food systems programming. And we've actually applied this with our work at IFPRI on looking at youth livelihoods. I'm gonna stop there. I know I've talked a lot, but this is basically a topic I can talk about the whole day, but it's been such a pleasure being able to do this with all of you. I'm gonna hand it back to you, Ed.
Thank you, Dr. Njuki. I think with that, we have time for maybe 8 minutes for Q&A. Is this on? Let me give me a second. Okay. Yes, questions? All right. If you can introduce yourself and just make your question brief and to the point.
Thank you. My name is Horace, a grad student. I want to ask 3 quick questions. One, from the presentation, I see a lot of bias on women, yet gender, I think, is a bit broader. Is that the
Can you speak up a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm saying from the presentation, the focus was more on women empowerment and all that, which is quite useful because they've lagged behind a lot in development, but gender could be much broader. Do you also work with other groups of gender? Then secondly, when focusing a lot on women, could it also create some form of inequality in some areas? Let me give an example. From your own context, in Kenya, for instance, around the central region of Kenya, there have been reports that now the boy child is threatened, for instance. What provisions within development happen in that case? Then lastly,
I want to leave time for other speakers. So you got those 2 questions?
Yes, I did.
Yes, you want to respond to that? While
Yes, let me respond to that quickly. And I think, thanks, Horace, for those questions. And I think you probably answered the first one yourself, because there has been a reason why we've focused on women a lot. And a lot of that is historical, the historical marginalization of women. The fact that we are not starting from the same base, and the fact that a lot of the barriers in laws, in institutions, we still see the biases against women. Those haven't stopped to date. So I want to say that there's a close relationship between the empowerment of women and gender equality. These are not disconnected concepts. And it is why I also bring in the intersectionality, because we need to think, even when we think about men and women, we need to think about young women, we need to think about young men, we need to think about indigenous women. Right now, there is a huge issue around land ownership for young people who are in agriculture, because we've got a land inheritance system that actually allocates land to children on the death of their parents. So if your parents are still alive and farming on their land, the likelihood that you do not have ownership of that land is very high. But we also cannot forget that once that inheritance time comes, the girls are less likely to get that land compared to boys. So these are issues we have to think about in a very systematic way. The second question you asked me, I have been asked a lot. A lot. And sometimes I don't have an answer to it, but this is what I will say. I usually do not understand the concept of boy child is threatened. I really still do not understand that concept. And I'll give you two perspectives to it. The first perspective is with the awareness of rights and women's rights. Yeah, the right to education, the right to sexual reproductive health, the right to decision-making around women's lives and their bodies. It can feel as though it is a war against men and boys. It is not. Because these are rights that have been denied for so long. And there's a saying that when you are not used to inequality, when you are not the oppressed, equality can feel like oppression. And I am trying to remember who said that equality can feel like oppression. And here we are just saying, what is the threat? Because that's always what I would like to understand. What is this threat to boys and men that we talk about from the acquisition by women of their rights? Is it just a feeling of threat because inequality or equality can feel like a threat? One of the things I'm seeing, especially with a lot of young men, is because of being brought up in households where a lot of women didn't have voice. And now you are sitting in class with young women and you are marrying young women who actually have a voice. That can feel like a threat. But all that has happened really is that we are expanding women's rights where those have been denied. And if people aren't used to that situation, it can feel like a threat. The power to do and the power within can start to feel as though it is power over because we have not experienced it before.
Thank you.
So we need to really put this into context. I come from central Kenya. I still do not know how boys are under threat. All men, they still own the land. I really have no understanding of that concept. From where I sit.
Thank you very much for that. My name is Michelle. I'm an MPS student in global development, and I previously worked with Plan International Myanmar, where a lot of our work had a big focus on being gender transformative. Of course, there were a lot of challenges involved, which I think your framework did a wonderful job of an overview of that. But one thing I saw was a lot of great strides happening in gender awareness with men who worked in the office on behalf of gender equality even. But one struggle that recurred at the local level, at institutional levels and beyond, that I think sometimes my local colleagues were unaware of was the kind of the shift required in how we view power dynamics, which is similar to Horace's question. And I think that when we deal with fundamental underlying causes, it can be viewed as very threatening, like you said, because the underlying implication would be a shift and involve restructuring the power dynamics in a way that can unfortunately cause a lot of opposition, usually with those with power. And in some cases, we saw it come back to harm the people we were trying to benefit, which caused a big shift in trying to involve parents, mothers and fathers, or grandparents, as well as men and young men in the process.
Yeah.
And I wondered specifically a long preamble to a short question, which is, how do you incentivize gender equality for men? And do you have any recommendations or methods for how to message that benefit of women empowerment to them?
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's a really fundamental question. One of the approaches for actually addressing power dynamics, for addressing norm change, is the engagement of men and boys. And one of the things that even in my work in Malawi that helped a lot is actually having male champions of change. There is a movement called the Men Engage Alliance that's global, led by the NGO Promudo, who actually work on these approaches of how do you engage men for gender equality and how do you get men on board that gender equality is important for them as well, that it benefits their households, that improve, like, you know, engaging women in decision making can lead to better decisions and better outcomes for the family, that it is good for communities, that having women's leadership in communities can be beneficial to communities because they bring different perspectives to the conversation. And this is areas where there's actually been evidence. The World Bank has been running these large experiments, especially in India, looking at community development from a perspective of women's leadership. So that's the second bit. How do we use some of the evidence to actually sit down and talk about that, you know, having women in leadership, having women, you know, making decisions, expanding women's opportunities is actually good, not just for women themselves. It is very good for women and important for women, and we must not lose sight of that, but also making sure they're seeing the benefits to communities, the benefits to households, the benefits to countries. But having male allies or male champions of change can be a huge added advantage to how you work in communities on norm change. So, and then the second part is also traditional leaders, because they have a lot of influence in terms of how they set examples for what's appropriate in communities. So even that engagement of traditional leaders and getting them on board in terms of these shifts in dynamics is very, very important. So the entry points to communities do matter. Because if you just enter with a explicit focus on women and do not engage community leaders, do not engage potential male allies, the potential for backlash is very, very high, because there will be resistance to sharing of power. There will be resistance to changes of norms and practices that people have practiced for generations, that have been passed on from generation to generation. And one of the things I say is, rather than prescribing what needs to happen, it is really facilitating a process of community reflection. You know, what do we do in a certain situation? Why do we do this? Who does it benefit? Who does it harm? How can we reduce harm? So having this critical set of questions that you are actually using to interrogate and to help communities to come up with some of these actions themselves is really, really critical.
Thank you. We have one last question here, but before 30 seconds.
Yes, very last. I would like to know, how can we assess, how can you have access to the framework? Because I would like to use it in my work back in Mozambique. Thank you.
access to the frameworks. And
I can send it to you, Ed, with the full
Yes.
presentation, and you can share as you see fit.
Thank you so very much. There was one last question online from Professor Haley Tufan on how come we still get it wrong? How come our food systems frameworks are still gender blind?
Oh, I wish I had an answer to that, Hale, after 20 years of working on this, but every new framework that I see comes out gender blind. I am hoping with this particular one, we can see progress. But one of the other things and why I really value the work that you're doing, Hale, is making sure that there is gender awareness and there's gender responsiveness in the people that are doing this work, whether they are breeders who are breeding our crops, whether they are economists working on market and trade systems. Building that capacity and awareness so that they are understanding gender and how gender links to everything that they do and how gender equality influences even the outcomes that they're looking for is really, really critical, because we still have a lot of people that are paying lip service to gender, but not understanding it enough to actually see how it integrates in their work. So programs like GRIT that you're running become then really critical entry points for building this capacity, so that the next person that develops a framework for us to analyze food systems ensures that gender is central to it.
Dr. Njuki, thank you so very much on behalf of the Cornell team.
And thank you so much for having me. This was excellent. I'm really energized.